Welcome to Planet People, a podcast that aims to inspire curiosity and cultivate a deeper connection with the natural world. I'm Natalie Jane, a conservation biologist, eco-communicator, and the host of this podcast series. And I am thrilled to be sharing stories with you that highlight the beauty and importance of protecting our planet's wildlife.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to this episode of Planet People. Today we have on an esteemed guest, Dr. Chris Lowe, who is a marine biologist and professor of marine biology at California State University, Long Beach. Dr. Lowe and his CSU Shark Lab are responsible for pioneering research methods, like tagging and monitoring great white sharks to better understand how these juvenile sharks behave, migrate, and adapt in our Southern California coastal waters. The Shark Lab was first founded in 1966 with Dr. Donald Nelson and has been instrumental in our understanding of great whites. Dr. Chris Lowe took over in 1998 to keep that legacy of white shark research alive. We learn about the reasons why juvenile great whites are active along Southern California shorelines and what we can do as beachgoers to have a better understanding of these sharks, and how we can most importantly stay safe while recreating in their home and at our gorgeous beaches. Thanks for being here and welcome to the show, Dr. Lowe.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the mission is with the CSU Shark Lab?
Yeah. So I grew up on the East Coast, but got a marine biology degree on the East Coast and then ventured west. And I actually got my master's degree in the Shark Lab back in the late 80s, and then got a PhD in zoology at the University of Hawaii, which is Shark Central. So it was a great place to go to graduate school. My advisor, Don Nelson, who founded the Shark Lab back in the 60s, unfortunately, he passed away in 1997, and I was hired as his replacement in 1998. So I've been running the Shark Lab for 25 years now, and have had the great fortune to recruit and train over 54 students, graduate students.
That's incredible. So what is the overall mission of the Shark Lab? What kind of research are you guys doing that supports shark conservation?
So in its early days, it focused on behavior. And that was what Don Nelson was known for. He was like the person in terms of shark behavior. And that's why I wanted to come train with him. And then what's happened over time, when I took over, I became more interested in physiology. And it was because behavior was really kind of squishy. It was hard to really nail down. And I began to realize that physiology dictates behavior. So if you can, it's more easy to measure an animal's physiology and then use that to ask, why is it behaving the way it is? So over time, the Shark Lab's missions kind of changed, right? So we've become probably a bit more integrative in our disciplines. So we use molecular biology, we use physiology, we use genetics, we use all those tools. And of course, we've really emphasized education and outreach.
Amazing.
So a lot of people are interested in sharks. So therefore, it's easy to take our science and make it relevant to the public.
That's great. And for our listeners tuning in, if you wouldn't mind describing what physiology is in layman's term for people to kind of get a better understanding of how that supports shark behavior as well.
Sure. So in many ways, we're like doctors. You know how you go to the doctor and the doctor will say, well, we're going to take some blood. And then they can use your blood to look for a variety of different chemicals. They can look for hormones, all sorts of things. And they can use that to understand if you're healthy. So we do many of the same things we've stolen from, human medicine to better understand what makes a shark healthy and what changes and how does its environment change its biochemical makeup and therefore its physiology. So, we use a lot of those techniques because they help us better understand what the shark is experiencing.
Fascinating. Thank you for explaining that further. And then I know you also mentioned how the CSU Shark Lab's mission is evolving, and part of that mission seems to be more focused on the education and outreach. So how is your research benefiting the public? Where is that value coming in outside of academia?
Yeah, so that's the interesting part. So, for example, all these sharks start showing up at public beaches and they're white sharks. And you say the word white shark at a public beach and people pay attention. But usually it's out of fear. So even the lifeguards who we work very closely with were concerned about the fact that there were white sharks hanging out off these beaches, even if those white sharks were babies. And of course, even a baby white shark has fairly big teeth and can do a lot of damage if it bit a person. But the question is, why are they there? Why do they choose that beach? Why are they so close to shore? What are they doing while they're there? If environmental conditions are changing, does that cause them to move? Or if the food leaves, do they leave? And what are they eating? So these were all questions that I thought, you know what? We can answer these questions. We have the tools now to do that. And lifeguards want that information because it helps them better understand whether those sharks pose a risk to people. And interestingly enough, a lot of people want to know those questions too.
Of course.
So the one thing we've learned is the less people know, the easier it is to scare them about something, because you can make anything up. And quite often their minds do just that for them. And it starts coming up with crazy scenarios of things that could happen to them while they're out in the water. And then when we tell them about what we're learning about these sharks, you can actually see the fear kind of come down. Like everybody calms down because they better understand why the animals are there.
Absolutely. So why are these juvenile white sharks showing up on Southern California waters? Have you been able to answer some of those many questions?
We can. And it's interesting because all sharks, when they're born, get no parental care. Moms give birth to them, either lays an egg or the moms give live birth, and those babies are completely on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So the number one reason why we think they like hanging out at beaches is because it's safe. And a lot of people don't think about that, right? So it's a white shark. What would it have to fear? But it doesn't know any better, right? It's born, it's completely naive. And by hanging out in shallow water, that's the safest place for it to be. Now, the other thing is they incubate in a warm mom, right? So white sharks, as long as they're swimming, can keep their body warmer than the water. So that means that those embryos can grow faster and they have faster physiologies. They can swim faster, they can think faster. Everything goes faster when it's warmer. So once that mom gives birth to them in cold water, it's kind of like thermal shock.
Sure.
By moving into the shoreline, it's warmer there than it is further offshore. So those two things we think are the main reasons why they like hanging out at those beaches. But remember, if you're there to avoid predators, you've also got to figure out what to eat, and there has to be sufficient food. So they're naive. They don't know how to eat yet. They're learning all that on their own. And it turns out at many of these beaches, there's a lot of fish for them to eat. In fact, the most abundant are stingrays. And we call them pancakes. So there's lots of pancakes on the bottom. They're easy to catch for these young sharks. So they make good meals for a naive, learning young shark.
That's fascinating. And it's even more interesting because aren't sharks and rays in the same family of elasmobranch?
They're in the same group. Yes.
Okay, they're in the same group.
They're closely related. They diverged at different times. So, sharks are around first, and then rays evolved from that ancestral group of sharks. And they do share many similar characteristics, but they're also different. And at times one will eat the other.
Oh, stingrays will also eat sharks?
Not necessarily stingrays, but some of the batoids, those are the flat
Yeah.
elasmobranchs, they'll eat small sharks.
Oh,
Yeah, if they can catch them.
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Sure, why not? They're all tasty.
Wow, fascinating. So for these two reasons, being warmer ocean temperatures and some food abundance being raised, that allows the sharks to come closer to shore and feel like they're, well, at least juvenile sharks, that they're in a secure environment until they reach a mature age to move further offshore.
That's what we think. So
Okay.
the reason why we call these nurseries is because in many ways the young sharks show up there and they hang out there because that's the only safe habitat they know. And what causes them to leave are changes in temperature. So if the temperature gets too cold, because their little bodies are so small, they can't keep the heat very well. So they act more like a cold-bodied shark. So when temperatures dip below 60 degrees, they don't like that. So that makes them want to move south where the water's warmer. So that will initiate usually their first migration. And we've learned from our tagging and tracking that a baby white shark in its first year can cover about 3,000 miles.
Impressive.
Yeah, so even though they're young, they're willing to migrate long distances to find appropriate conditions.
That's incredible that your research with tagging and tracking these juvenile sharks are showing this long migration. What does tagging a shark look like? I know you said you were in the field yesterday. The day-to-day field work, are you typically tagging juvenile white sharks?
As much as we can.
Okay.
So usually in the past, what we did was we relied on fishermen. And if fishermen accidentally caught them in their nets, they would call us up. We'd meet the fishermen at the dock. We could take measurements of the sharks, take blood, take a little tissue for genetics, and then we could attach a variety of different transmitters that would help us answer different types of movement questions. The problem is fishers didn't catch them very often. So if we wanted to tag more sharks, we had to do it on our own. And then we found that they were very close to the beach. So we couldn't get in there with a boat. So sometimes we would actually partner with the lifeguards, and my students would be on the back of a lifeguard jet ski.
Cool.
So to see the sharks in the early days, we would use helicopters or planes, and then they would communicate via radio. The sheriff's department, the police department, fire departments had helicopters, and sometimes they would spot for us at their jurisdictional beach. That was very expensive, and we could only get about an hour of their time. So then drones started to become popular, and drones have become a really valuable tool for us. So because a drone's relatively cheap and we can cover a lot of area, and we can easily see the sharks and then tell a boat, here's where the shark is, and the boat drives to the drone, and the drone is right above the shark. And then we can drive right alongside the shark, and we could dart a tag in the shark's back. We can dip a camera underneath them so that we can tell if it's a male or a female, and then use that size of the boat to estimate the size of the shark if the shark's at the surface. So by using this technique, we could tag 60 sharks a year.
So cool. I mean, what a great integration of using different resources at your disposal, from the size of the boat to the drone and to the people component too. I mean, the fishermen, the lifeguards, everyone is involved in this, what I like to call a social ecological effort, where we see people and resources interacting in different ways, and using that social ecological system to like benefit the ecosystem that we're studying it's really cool. And ultimately, the more people you have on board to help you and be interested, the better the result, it sounds like, which is fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that in order for people to work together like that, they all have to see the benefit for them, right? So there has to be a benefit for them. For lifeguards, it was, we don't know when we should close a beach. When is it safe? And is it safe for our guards to be in the water, right? Or we're training junior lifeguards. Is it safe for them to swim out there? So they had a vested interest in partnering with us. The fishermen had a vested interest because they get in trouble. These are protected species. So they needed to know whether a shark that was caught in their nets, that was alive, that we were able to tag and release, could survive. And we found that 97% of the sharks survived.
Oh, wow.
So this really helped the fishermen, right? So everybody had to see the value for themselves, and what that did for the community. And remember, we're talking about the human community here. Was it gave everybody a better understanding of how we all shared interest and access to this resource, right? So in many ways, we were part of the ecology of the system.
I love that. Yeah, it's so true. And you really do see the community come together, and for everyone to understand it. That's really the value that comes from science in general, is sharing that information beyond an academic setting and getting people involved, and seeing what they can do to help and learn more. And I think that's the beauty of science, right? Going beyond the lab and the research, and sharing with the community. So that's great that you've been able to do that. in relation to the drone footage, our previous guest, actually, Dinah, was the one who mentioned what your lab is doing. And she said that she had been working with, I think, one of your master students, right, Coral, who was working with you, and she was collecting drone footage for you guys. And it's pretty cool. And speaking of drone footage, I know there was recent news around capturing a juvenile white shark on footage being born for the first time. Is that correct?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay, explain that for me.
Sure. So there are a lot of recreational drone pilots that go out and fly, and they love getting video footage of sharks, which is really cool. And they share a lot of that footage with us and are trying to help us answer questions. So one of those drone pilots happened to get a video of what he thought was a newborn.
I see.
And the hypothesis was the shark was born there. And while that shark was very young, we have no real evidence. There was no female nearby. We didn't see it coming out of a female. So
Okay.
as scientists, we need to be skeptical. We need to ask, okay, is this the only possible explanation for this, or is there an alternative? And in that case, it was an interesting observation, but there's no direct evidence that the shark was born there.
Okay.
So this is tricky, it's interesting, and scientists are eager to understand, because there was like this white milky film on the shark, and we didn't know whether that was some, embryonic covering or whether the shark had some skin disorder. So we've seen sharks with weird skin disorders in the past, so we just don't know. So unfortunately for me, there wasn't enough conclusive data for me to think, okay, that shark was born there. A lot of circumstantial evidence, but not what I would call, hardcore data. So while it's very possible, for me, it was inconclusive. So these are the things that, we really want to be careful about, because you can mislead science. You can lead science down a wrong path if we're not careful and make sure that we have sufficient data to back up what we think is going on. So, and that hypotheses are designed to be tested.
Of course.
So then the next question is, well, how will we test that? So these are the sorts of things that, I try to teach my students, want my students to learn how to do. And we always want to make sure that we do good science, because in some cases, bad science has been used in management of species and has actually done more damage than it's done good.
Do you have an example of that that's related to great white sharks?
Yeah. So this is probably 2010, a group up north published a paper where they claimed that there were only 315 white sharks in California. And at the time, we were getting fishermen calling us all the time saying, we keep catching these baby white sharks. So what happened was that paper got published. It got a lot of press. And in that paper, they said, well, we think that's too low and the white shark population's in trouble. So then what happened was a couple conservation groups submitted petitions to the state and federal government to list white sharks as threatened and endangered. And at the same time, we were catching and tagging more and more and more white sharks. So we kept saying, well, they're already protected. So the data that they get up north does not match what we see down here. So what happened was, here's a paper that got published, and that paper was being used to try to drive management or conservation, but it wasn't complete. And therefore, a lot of the fishermen that we were working with got really upset by that, stopped working with us.
No.
And as a result, the state did not get good data because fishermen weren't reporting when they were catching white sharks.
Oh my gosh.
So this is an example of how, if you don't have good data, how it can lead you down a bad path, and it can actually hurt resources in the long run. So, that's an example.
That's interesting. And I'd love for you to expand on tagging and how that data is actually helping counteract bad science like that. For our listeners that may not have a scientific background
Sure.
and have no idea what we mean by tagging, like
Yeah.
what exactly does that mean, and what are you guys following? And for how long when you guys tag these sharks? Is it forever or is it just for a certain period of time? Yeah, I'd love for you to expand on just the aftermath of like once you have tagged a shark.
Sure. So, first of all, there's a variety of different types of tags we use, and each one can help you answer a different question. So, and by the way, they're not cheap.
Mm.
So the more expensive ones are about $5,000 a piece. Those are the satellite transmitters. And when we dart a satellite transmitter into a shark, we have two types. We have ones that we can bolt to the shark's dorsal fin. And every time the fin breaks the surface, it's a powerful radio transmitter. It's transmitting to satellites in orbit. And then those satellites will send me a text and
Oh,
will give me
cool.
the latitude, longitude, time, and date and ID of that shark.
Wow.
But the minute that shark goes underwater, it stops transmitting because those radio waves cannot penetrate through seawater. So the tag is only designed to transmit when it's in air. Okay, so there are a couple challenges with using that technology. First of all, sharks are not like marine mammals. They don't have to come to the surface. So you could put a $3,000 transmitter on the animal and get very little data back. The other part is you're actually bolting this to the shark's fin. And eventually that battery dies on the transmitter and you need that device to fall off without doing a lot of damage to the fin. And that's a problem. So in the early days, we didn't know how well they would stay on, how long they would last, and how much data we would get. Unfortunately, we recaptured a shark a year later that had a transmitter on it, and I got to see how much damage it did to the dorsal fin, and I stopped using them. I won't use them anymore. Unfortunately, the designs that we're using, unfortunately, cause too much damage to the fin. I just don't feel comfortable with that. The other type of satellite transmitters are ones that you dart into the shark's back and they hang off kind of like a little earring, very expensive earring. It's got a temperature, depth, and light sensor, and it's recording those at whatever rate we want, say every 30 seconds. And then at a pre-described time and date, that tag will pop off the shark, float up to the surface, upload that data to the satellite, which then downloads it to me in an email. So now what I get is a really accurate temperature and depth record of that shark. So I know what's its favorite temperature, what's its favorite depth. And from the light data, we can kind of get a geoposition, like where it is in space. And we also know where it was tagged and where it popped up. So that technology has really helped us understand migration of these sharks, how far they can travel, the temperatures and depths of the water that they like to move through. But the geoposition isn't very accurate. It's like 60 nautical miles. So if we really want to know how close a shark gets to, say, a beach, we use this other type of technology called acoustic telemetry. So instead of using radio waves, we're now using lower frequency sound waves, which travel really well through seawater. So now if I catch a shark, I can flip it upside down and I can surgically implant a transmitter into that shark's body that has this basically surgical epoxy. So it's inert in the shark's body and it will last 10 years.
Oh, wow.
So that transmitter is constantly pinging at a very slow rate. And when that shark gets within about 300 yards of one of our underwater receivers, the receiver will log the time, the date, and the ID of that shark. And some of those transmitters have temperature and depth sensors on them. So we also get the temperature and depth at the time of detection. Now, if the shark's too big for us to catch and do surgery on, we can always just dart one of these into the shark's back. Now, the one we surgically implant, that transmitter will be there forever till the shark dies. Batteries die after 10 years. Anything we put on the outside of the animal, they're going to get rid of. Takes about 3 years, but eventually all earrings fall out. So, those transmitters just get sloughed off after the batteries die. So then we can go out, a team can pick up those receivers, download them, team of divers, we can download them and put them back. So by doing that, we can tell whether a shark is within 300 yards of a beach. So by using these combinations of technologies, some sharks we put all three on, and we were able to look at long-range migration and long-term site fidelity to beaches and the temperature and depth of the water they liked. And then the fourth form of technology we refer to as biologging. So this we make our own. It's called a smart tag, and it's got a temperature, depth sensor. It's got a 3D accelerometer, 3D magnetometer, and 3D gyroscope. So it's basically measuring every single motion the shark makes 30 times a second.
Oh,
Wow.
It's got an acoustic tag on it, so we can follow that shark from a boat. It's got a video logger, so we can see what the shark sees, and it'll record 12 hours of video. And this clamps on the shark's dorsal fin like a little backpack. And then after 24 hours, this thing pops off, floats up to the surface. And with a radio transmitter, we can go get it back and download it just like you would your Fitbit. And by doing that, we can basically count how many tail beats did that shark have? When was it swimming the fastest? What depth was it at? And then C, was it actually chasing something? So using all these combinations of technologies, now we can begin to understand how these sharks make decisions.
Yeah. Wow. That the last one you described definitely does sound like a Fitbit.
It's just like a Fitbit.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So what are some interesting things that you found with all of these different technologies that is kind of new findings in the past 10 years or so?
Yeah, so I would say from the tracking, probably that these aggregation sites, so these sharks form these aggregations, up to 40 individuals hanging out at a beach, and that they'll move between aggregation sites. And now we're starting to understand what makes a good aggregation site. So there has to be the right water temperature. Generally, their favorite is between about 65 degrees and about 72 degrees. That's the favorite. And then, but they can tolerate temperatures down to just below 60 degrees. If it stays below 60 degrees, the smallest sharks are out. They just don't like it. It's too cold. They can survive those temperatures. They just don't like them. Once they're bigger and they have more mass, they can keep their bodies warmer longer and therefore can tolerate cooler temperatures. So that may influence when they start moving north of Point Conception. So Southern California Bight is the warmest part of California. And then you get around Point Conception and you start heading up towards Monterey and the water gets a lot colder. So only those larger sharks can tolerate those temperatures. But now we've learned, based on some of this tagging and tracking, that there's a new nursery site that is now evolved up in Santa Cruz. So in Santa Cruz, that part of Monterey Bay is the warmest. It's the northern part of Monterey Bay. And then the other interesting thing is the oceanography of Monterey Bay has shown that it's progressively been getting warmer over the last 30 years.
Is that from climate change?
Exactly. So, those data kind of showed us what we should be expecting in the future, right? So as the oceans continue to warm, these sharks are looking for those warmer conditions, especially for the young ones. And that may start happening further north. The other thing that we've learned from our tagging and tracking is that white sharks don't like water temperatures above 82 degrees. So 82 and above is too hot. So that means during El Niños, even parts of Baja get too warm, and that pushes more of the population up north. So these are some of the things that we've learned about how it influences migration. We've actually done some really cool studies at these aggregation sites where we're able to track movements of sharks in 3D.
Oh, cool.
And one of the things we found is that these areas are very thermodynamic, which means you've been to the beach and you walk down and you're knee deep and you're like, wow, it's pretty warm. And then you walk down the beach 100 yards and then the water's cool. So these areas are very thermally changing. They change over space and they change with depth. So this study the student did found that they're actually selecting where they want to be in the water column and where they want to be spatially based on water temperatures. Remember those favorite temperatures? And that they're making decisions on the kind of range of about 30 feet around them. So it's like being in a pool where the shallow gets warm and the deeper part gets cold. And you're moving around the pool going, oh, that's too cold. Oh, that's too warm. Here's where I want to be. So that's basically what we found that they'll do.
Really cool. So with all of this tagging and research that you're doing, and the data you're collecting from it, how does this become useful for formulating conservation management of the species? Because you said they were, in 2010, when they did that poor research program, they had said that sharks were more threatened than they actually were. I know IUCN still lists them as threatened, but how does your research help manage the conservation of the species, and what is their status today?
So that's the tough question, right? So counting how many are out there has always been the hard part. And even though we've been able to better monitor and count, the problem is we don't know, we have no clue how many there were 20, 50, 100, 200 years ago. So all we can say is since we've been keeping records, we are seeing the numbers of sharks go up. So, but we don't know how much. In addition, based on historic records, we assume that the white shark population's probably been affected by overfishing for probably about 100 years. But it's not just white sharks being killed. So it's not just overfishing of them. Remember, marine mammals in the Pacific and in the Atlantic were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. So since then, they didn't receive federal protection until the 70s.
Right, which is
But
crazy.
since then, many marine mammal populations have been going up better than marine mammal biologists thought were possible. So now their food sources come back. They were protected since 1994. So it kind of makes sense that we should be seeing the white shark population increase. We just don't know how much. So then the next question is, we keep seeing more and more every year. At some point, the population has to plateau. When will that be? And is that going to be when they've eaten too many marine mammals? Probably not. That will be a long time coming, right? So these are still unknowns, but we are getting a better idea of what the population is doing. We know it's not endangered. In fact, white sharks are still caught and incidentally killed in fisheries, whether it's recreational or commercial, but obviously not at a rate fast enough to cause the population to go down.
Sounds like there are some still very current threats to shark populations, including bycatch, overfishing. What are some other conservation threats that white sharks face in Southern California? I know we talked about climate change a little bit. How is maybe the ocean temperature also impacting their movement and maybe numbers, even though that's hard to quantify? But in terms of threats to the species, what does that look like?
So fisheries threats actually are going down.
That's great.
Simply because there's less. There's less commercial fishing now than there was 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Why is that?
Basically, they're being overregulated. So unfortunately, they're regulated so heavily that they can't stay commercially viable. Now, the problem with that is everyone still likes to eat seafood.
Yeah.
So the same things we regulate California fishermen from catching can be caught by Mexican fishermen and trucked across the border, and you can buy it cheaper than you would if you bought it from a California fisherman. So unfortunately, this isn't solving our problem. It's like taking a balloon and squeezing it. And all we've done is cause that to get displaced. So in the case of white sharks, they don't know where the border is. They swim back and forth between California and Mexico all the time. And there are different fisheries management practices in both countries. So California's fisheries are going down. Mexico fisheries have been fairly stable, and their regulations aren't the same. So as a result, the population overall has been going up. But that doesn't mean there's not disproportionate threats, right? Probably the biggest concern, I think, right now is not climate change. I think right now, white sharks are enjoying our current climate because it benefits them physiologically. Question is 20, 30 years from now, if it keeps warming up, will that continue to happen? And I have a feeling that they're going to run out of room. So as it gets warmer, we expect sharks to get pushed further north because they're seeking out those environmental conditions. But as they get pushed further north, what if there aren't adequate food resources? The things that they like to eat just don't occur there or have been overfished. So now they're forced to live in a place where the environment is better, but there's less food. So these are the things, and it won't happen overnight. This is going to take decades to actually measure, but this is what we should be predicting will happen if we don't start dealing with climate change more seriously. The other issues are pollution, right? And that could be in the form of plastic pollution or other contaminants that affect everything in the ocean. So we just don't know the impacts that many of those things have on sharks. Turns out sharks might actually be a little bit more resilient to some contaminants than other species, which is interesting. In other words, we might be able to learn something from them if we better understand how they do that. But eventually, those contaminants may become overwhelming and the animals just won't be able to tolerate it anymore.
Is one of those contaminants DDT, as I'm aware that's been found off the coast of Southern California very recently?
Yep. And we've measured DDT in sharks and rays for 25 years. Levels were actually going down. So DDT and PCBs are decreasing. Remember, those compounds were banned back in the 70s.
Right. Thanks
But
to Rachel Carson.
Exactly. But we're dealing with legacy, right? So, and we're talking about tons were dumped into the marine environment. So, the reason why those compounds were so successful was because they don't break down, or they don't break down easily. So therefore they last a very long time. And the other bad thing about those compounds is they're what we call lipophilic. So lipid loving. So they bind to fats. And if they bind to fat, it means it's easier for it to get into a cell of an animal. And that's where the toxicity issues occur. So environmentally, many of those contaminants are getting buried, and they're slowly disappearing from the environment. But that doesn't mean you warm things up. Now, even a lower level of contamination may now have a lethal effect. So these are things we still don't understand very well.
And with the ocean temperatures warming, is that causing the DDT to be more likely to attach to animal cells?
No, but they have to eat more. And if they eat more, they're going to ingest more of the contaminant, right? So these are things that, many of my students are learning how to do. So we do some physiology. We measure the metabolism of a shark. And if you know what its metabolism is, and you know how many calories it has to consume per day, and you know how many calories a squid or an anchovy or a crab are worth, then you can do some math. These are cold-bodied animals. So when the water's cold, their metabolism is low. And when the water warms up, their metabolism goes up. And then sometimes that metabolism increase is like 3 or 5-fold. So, just an El Nino can cause horn sharks' metabolism to increase by 25%.
Wow.
That means they have to eat 25% more food during an El Nino than they would during a non-El Nino. So if you speed all that up, not only are they consuming more, which there may be less prey, but they're also acquiring more contaminants, and those are getting into their livers and their cells where they can be more toxic.
I see. So that's definitely kind of an issue then, the question of prey availability in terms of water warming and the metabolism of a shark increasing. That means they're eating more, but is that where we begin to see maybe shark populations take a plateau if there's less prey available for them to feed on?
Yep, absolutely. Or moving somewhere else, trying to find better food, right?
Sure.
So this is not the first time this has happened, right? As an animal groups, these animals have been through these challenges before because our climate's changed in the past too. The difference is we have a few more insults, right? So we've got more contaminants in the environment that are anthropogenic, right? Plastics that don't break down and the compounds that are released from those, that evolutionarily are not things that those animals have had to deal with in the past. They do now. Right. So that's going to be the challenge.
So what are some of their evolutionary adaptations that they have used for their survival for the last 250 million years? I mean, sharks have been around longer than a lot of other animals and even trees, I think, if I'm correct on that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's a lot of evolutionary biologists that are really interested in sharks because of that long history. And they've changed considerably. And the part we have to remember is, there's been at least 5 mass extinctions on the planet.
Right.
And 2 of those, like wiped out 90% of life on Earth. So when you think about, you've got this animal lineage that's survived 400 plus million years, survived several mass extinctions or re-radiated. Obviously they were doing something right and have retained those genes, right? What I find really interesting, and I know a bunch of people are starting to look into, is many sharks have much larger genomes than humans. So, for example, a white shark's genome is 5 times larger than ours.
Wow.
What is a genome? Just so we can explain to our audience.
All its DNA.
Okay.
So if we were to count up all the base pairs in its DNA, 5 times more.
It's incredible.
So what is all that DNA for? So what if they're carrying, let's say they're hoarders, they're DNA hoarders, gene hoarders.
Yeah. They
And
have
then
5 mass extinctions to carry with them.
exactly.
Yeah.
So who knows? You may
Yeah.
need that old DNA for that
Mhm.
gene that produces this enzyme that helps you deal with this temperature. We just don't know. So there's a lot of really cool things that could explain why sharks have been around so long. And it's going to require people with an interest in genetics and molecular biology and mathematics and computer science, because we're talking about big, big numbers. So I think there's a lot of cool things to do there. Their immune systems are different, very different. Sharks have nanobodies, which are cool miniature antibodies, which we really don't fully understand how they work. We've harnessed the power of their nanobodies. We've used them in developing vaccines and all sorts of
Oh,
things.
wow.
And what's weird is sharks have nanobodies. The next group of animals that have them are like llamas and camels.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
So this big evolutionary jump, and then they have nanobodies again. So all sorts of weird things.
Interesting.
And they're not, are they found in whales as well or no?
No,
Oh.
Oh.
no.
Would it be considered a healing property then to have those nanobodies?
Well, it definitely has some function, right?
Yeah.
So we're not exactly sure what that function is, but they're half or a third of the size of an antibody. So they're even smaller.
Wow.
So the question that many physiologists have is, what would be the advantage of having something? Think of nanobodies as stickers, right? And you put stickers on things that are bad. An antigen, something bad gets into the body, it's not supposed to be there. You put a sticker on it. And that sticker is to alert your immune system, your phagocytes, that that's bad. It's going to be killed and taken out. So you have antibodies, which are big, and they bind into all these things. But then you got these little tiny stickers. So what do those little stickers do? This is stuff that I think is so fascinating.
Yeah, that's cool. What are some other evolutionary adaptations that have given sharks, great white sharks, a leverage up to survive these 5 mass extinctions?
Well, I remember white sharks are newcomers, evolutionary newcomers. They're only probably about 12 million years, right? So they're considered pretty advanced as sharks go. And probably their biggest, they and their cousins, close cousins, most interesting advantages are their warm-bodiedness, the fact that they can keep their body warmer than the water. And how they do that is really interesting. So they have their red muscle, which is their constant swimming muscle, is located deeper in their body, so that the heat that muscle makes is protected by the surrounding muscle, so that it isn't lost immediately to the water. And then the other trick that they have is these blood vessels called a rete. And it's like a net that goes around where the blood passes, cold oxygenated blood coming from the gills passes right by this warm deoxygenated blood coming from the muscle. And by passing right by each other, that heat is transferred. And they're able to retain 97% of the heat.
Oh, wow.
That the red muscle generates. So if you touched a white shark, you would go, well, it doesn't feel warm. But if you stuck a thermometer in it, and the deeper the thermometer got, you would watch the mercury rise, right? So the advantage of that is warm muscle twitches faster. Nerves work faster when they're warmer. Enzymes break down substrates faster when they're warmer. So white sharks get to be 4,000 pounds. An adult can launch itself 8 feet in the air. The way they do that is by keeping their muscles warmer than the water. So the advantage is now you get to feed on other warm-bodied animals that are really fast and nimble, like seals, sea lions, dolphins, and whales.
I'm imagining now a shark jumping 8 feet out of the water And
Yeah,
that's
4,000 pounds, right?
have you seen that happen before?
Yes. Yeah, it's
Oh
Oh
my
my
amazing.
gosh.
gosh.
Yeah, like a
Wow.
submarine is launching next to you.
Oh
That's
my
so
gosh.
cool.
How big was the biggest one you saw launch out of the water?
Probably 14 feet.
Wow.
God,
Yeah. Big splash. Big
that's
Yeah.
splash.
gnarly.
Yeah. But remember, makos can do it, freshers can do it, salmon sharks can do it. All their cousins, closely related cousins, are all warm-bodied to a certain degree. So that means that's a big advantage that they have over their prey, which are cold. So if you're swimming in cold water, your prey, remember, their muscles can only contract at the rate at which that water temperature will allow. And if you're warmer than those animals, you have a big advantage.
A big advantage of eating them, it sounds like.
Absolutely, right? And seeing them out, thinking them, because your body is warmer. Everything happens faster.
So it seems like that's the number one evolutionary advantage that's benefited sharks for as long as they've been on planet Earth.
Well, at least the warm-bodied ones,
Sure, the
right?
warm-bodied ones.
So remember, the cold-bodied ones are in the same boat, but here's the advantage of getting big. If you're a cold-bodied shark and you hang out near the surface where the water's warm, you can warm your big body, right? And then you can go deeper. How long do you think it would take to cool that big body down? It takes time, right? So for an hour, you might have a big thermal advantage over your cold-bodied prey that are smaller. So it could be that even cold-bodied sharks started to behave in ways where they would warm themselves, and then they could go into colder, deeper water and take advantage of those colder prey that couldn't move as fast.
A study that I saw recently was they found a lot of heavy metals in
Mhm.
sharks, and they think that maybe that is another evolutionary advantage that they've been kind of collecting these heavy metals and they're not affected the way that humans are. And I'm just kind of wondering, obviously we don't have an answer for this, but these new elements in their environment, like plastic, like
Mhm.
this, all of these dumpings of
DDT.
chemicals,
Mhm.
are we going to see that they're collecting that as well and building up some sort of immunity to it?
Good question. We don't know. We don't know. Remember, many of those compounds are novel compounds, right? They're human made, and they
Hmm.
don't naturally exist
Yeah.
in those environments. So think of what happened with COVID, right? Here's a virus that we had no immunity to. So in this case, evolution has allowed our immune systems to adapt, but in the meantime, it could kill a lot of people. In the case of these contaminants like metals, sharks, like many vertebrates, also have detoxification compounds, ways that they can either isolate those metals and excrete them, or like mercury is a good example, right? So inorganic mercury is in the water, and animal can eat it, but it can't get into the cells unless that mercury has become methylated. So it turns out bacteria actually can take inorganic mercury, which, by the way, is in a lot of our fossil fuels that get into the atmosphere. And when it rains, it carries all that inorganic mercury to the ocean. And then bacteria methylate that mercury. By methylating the mercury, think of it, remember the lipophilic allows to get into the cells? Methylated compounds can enter cells as well. And that's how animals acquire mercury and stored in their tissues. Now, a cool thing about sharks and many vertebrates is as your mercury levels go up, you'll also start to retain selenium. So selenium is this other element, and it turns out that as you increase selenium, it binds to mercury, turning it into a compound that can be excreted. So they actually have a way of getting rid of mercury, which is really cool,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Because mercury is toxic, right?
Yeah.
And some animals can tolerate much higher levels of mercury than we can. Remember, they're cold-bodied, their metabolisms are much lower than ours, but they have a way of detoxifying by increasing some of these other elements in their tissues. So there's all these cool things that we're learning about that have probably enabled some of these animals to survive as long as they have, right?
Yeah.
It's the new compounds that we just don't know.
So speaking of new compounds, I have to ask your thoughts about the biggest thing in the news, I feel like the past couple weeks.
I know what you're going to ask.
Cocaine shark off of Brazil.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that? We've already seen cocaine bear, but now we have cocaine sharks. I'm sure that the rights are already
Oh, I'm sure.
bought. Yeah, we'll see it in 2025, 2026 come out. Yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it's actually while it made a lot of news, it's not news.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues, who's a really good physiologist, a guy named Dr. Jim Gelschleider in Florida, he and his students were looking at sharks in Florida and found a whole suite of pharmaceuticals in them. So, for
Gosh.
example, Prozac was really high in
Wow.
sharks. You name the pharmaceutical, he was able to measure it in them. So remember, we humans, Prozac doesn't naturally occur in the environment, right? But those of us that take those kinds of medications, when you urinate a lot of those compounds out and they go into the wastewater treatment systems. So then they get flushed out. And at most wastewater treatment, they cannot, chelate many of those compounds. They can't suck them out of the environment, out of the water, and they get discharged in the environment. So those fish or sharks are swimming around eating things that have ingested or swallowed those compounds. And before you know it, it shows up in their tissues. So 12, 15 years ago, when Jim published this paper, it was exact same news. Oh my God, sharks have Prozac. Why aren't they so calm? That sort of thing. And the bottom line was, despite the fact he was able to measure it, we had no idea what impact it had on the animal's physiology. Who is doing studies looking at if we dose a shark with Prozac, will it cause them to calm down? Right? So the same thing with cocaine.
Maybe the opposite effect there, but
yeah. But they metabolize it. So eventually it leaves their system like it does all vertebrates. The question is, does it affect their physiology or their behavior? And is it different than it is in humans? So, and we're learning that many of those compounds do behave differently in those animals because they're cold-bodied. Their bodies are cold, their metabolisms are low. It may take longer for those compounds to clear their bodies, but it may also not have the same effect.
Interesting.
So, as Hollywood as that sounds, there's no evidence that sharks are all jazzed up because they're all coked up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially with the Prozac. Now I'm just envisioning we have
right.
We have just a whole slew of antidepressant and cocaine. I can't imagine what else. But it's interesting to know that even just like you ingesting something and then using the bathroom, like that's going to affect what's collected in sharks and other marine animals.
Yep, there's that. Remember, people flush old pills down the toilet. That increases the concentrations of those chemicals. There are all sorts of things that cause those into the environment. And the other part you have to remember is that many of those compounds that we measure in those animals, if we eat them, we have reacquired those pharmaceuticals. So that's where we really need to pay attention, right? Because it sounds, kind of ridiculous, right? But if people are eating these things, they're acquiring those. And we do know the pharmacological effects of those compounds on humans. So imagine you're feeding it to your kids, right? So knowing what gets into the wildlife and knowing the impacts it has on people, this is why we have to study these things.
Yeah, absolutely. On the topic of Hollywood, since we're talking about cocaine sharks, what about Jaws? How did that influence people's perspective and sort of the human psychology around our perception of sharks?
Yeah, so Jaws was, it was just, it was a great book, turned into a great movie. And at the time, we just knew nothing about white sharks. So it as ridiculous as it may sound now, it wasn't, it was very plausible. So, we kind of made the animal a beast. So, and because we knew so little about them, it was easy to sell that image. And remember, in the movie Jaws, have you guys seen it?
Yes.
How many times do you actually see a real shark?
That's a good point. Not many times. You really just see the fin.
If you record the total screen time of a shark, it's very little. right?
Yeah.
That's true.
So most of that movie is what you generate in your head. It's the tension, it's the anxiety, it's the, the drama behind that. But none of it was based on anything real about white
It's true.
sharks. So it's a classic horror movie, and that's literally the way it is. But it was real enough in that people knew white sharks exist, and they knew they were swimming around in waters. And then we let our imaginations do the rest. So the tricky part is, Ben, how do we change that perception, right? That people have just from watching the movie. So this is where our education outreach program is so important. Because now that people are starting to learn that those babies are hanging out at those beaches because it's for safety, and they want to be warm, and they need easy to capture food, they start looking at those sharks differently. So they don't look at them as jaws. They look at them as baby white sharks who are just want to be safe, want to be warm, and want an easy meal. And humans aren't on the menu. So that's what's changing those perceptions. But what's amazing is next year, I think, is the 50th anniversary of Jaws.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Taking us 50 years
I
to
know.
really break that
Well,
mindset.
I know that he actually regrets making Jaws, because even though it is so iconic, it just had such detrimental impact on great whites and the fear-based just hysteria over it. And we do see shark attacks.
Mhm.
And you were talking earlier about working with lifeguards and spreading that awareness. Something that you mentioned, just how your lifeguards have incentive to help you guys because they want to know if they're going to be safe, if their patrons are going to be safe. What is considered safe? I know that to the media, every single summer, you always see it. Shark attack, like everyone gets so scared, but like it is really a minimal number at the end of the day. But for our listeners and just for in general, like what is the baseline? Okay, it's safe.
Well, and again, what we have to do is try to put this in perspective, right, to our daily lives. So humans are a really interesting animal in that we have the ability to greatly regulate risks, right? And the ways that we've done that is, we spend a lot of time and money making things more safe to reduce injury to people. Think of all the training you have to do to drive a car and all those things, right? If you go to the beach, your parents will want you to know how to swim. Obviously, if you're going to go in the water, all that training is designed to help keep you safe, right? With that said, over the last 100 years, I'd say Americans have gotten really poor at risk assessment.
What makes you say that?
Well, we expect our safety. I call it the Disneyland effect, right?
Oh, okay.
You go to Disneyland, you go on a ride, you expect the ride will be safe, right? It was engineered by engineers and it gets inspected, and there are people that know how to run the ride, and you're going to be safe. That is not the case when you go in the ocean, right? And lifeguards, their job isn't to save you. Their job is to help you if you get into trouble. But they're not going to push you into the water. You're the one who has to make that decision. So if you're worried about sharks, don't go in the water. If you're not worried about sharks and there are sharks there, your probability of being bitten, you have a better chance of winning the lottery. So then the question is, what are you worried about? I always come back to cars, but we're in cars all the time. So it's not a fair comparison mathematically, but it's close. I go to a school, I'll give a talk, I'll ask kids, how many of you have been in a car accident? It's amazing how many kids raise their hands, right? Southern California, who hasn't been a fender bender or whatever? Okay, and then I might say, well, does anybody know anybody who's killed in a car accident? And it was amazing how many hands go up of people they know, right? Okay, now if I asked, how many of you know somebody who has been bitten by a shark or killed by a shark? Almost no hands go up, right? So I'm like, well, you get in a car and you drive, even though you know those horrible things happen. But most of the time, it does not. Like a vast, vast, vast majority of the time, it does not. So therefore, what are you worried about? Going in the ocean. So it's getting people to understand real probability, doing a real risk assessment. And granted, if it's a beach and there's a lot of white sharks there, certainly your chances of being bitten are higher there than at a beach where there are no sharks. There's no doubt, because that's just increasing raw probability. But what I find interesting is the fact that we have those beaches with lots of sharks and lots of people, and yet people aren't being bitten. So when I use that as an example for the public, then I say, look, how do we explain this? You've been taught that if a shark is nearby, it's going to bite you. And what this is clearly telling us is that they don't care. Sharks ignore us. We're not food, and we're not posing a threat, and therefore we're freeway noise. Right? If you live near the freeway and a friend comes to visit and they live in, the desert, or they live in the woods, and they're like, what is that noise? How do you tolerate that? And you go, what noise? It becomes background, right? And that's exactly what I think these young white sharks do with people. They're around people all the time. They can easily identify humans, but they don't chase them, and they're not food. So therefore, we get ignored.
I love your metaphors that you've been using throughout this entire interview. I think it makes everything you're saying so much more like digestible and relatable, and it's a great way to get your message across. But Coral, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to ask, have you seen a correlation of what somebody might be doing when they get bit or attacked? Like, is there, like, if they're on a paddleboard, or, what is there a correlation, or have you guys not seen that?
No. And there's the International Shark Attack File, which has been kept since the 50s.
Wow.
We have data going back to the 1700s, 1600s. It has something like 7,000 records. And from all those records, we still don't see any clear patterns. So when you start looking, well, what water user group is more likely to be bitten? It turns out it's surfers, but surfers predominate in certain places. If you ask time of day, there's like 3 little bumps. There's a bump at dawn, there's a big hump in midday, and there's another little bump in the evening. And a lot of it has to do those morning and dawn, which is when we say sharks feed the most.
Yeah.
That's when most surfers are in the water before school and after work, right? And then that big hump during middays, that's when a bulk of the people are in the water. So how do you separate out, a shark's propensity to bite a person unprovoked versus when people are exposed to sharks? You can't have a bite unless somebody's in the water with them. And when people are in the water and what they're doing could influence that. So there's a lot that we still don't understand. Shark numbers have been down for over 50 years. Now they're coming back. More people are using the ocean than ever before, and climate change is influencing that, right? So as it gets hotter, more people go to the beach because it's one of the few places you can go and cool down for free. So that's going to push more people into the ocean. Sharks are coming back. If you were to ask me, are bites going to increase? Probably a little bit. But right now, sharks just don't seem to care about people.
So speaking of surfers, I know surfers will check apps and like the Weather Channel, talking about like tides and just the height of the waves and everything. Is there any sort of resource that people can check of how many sharks are seen in the waters of whatever beach that they're going to go to? Is there anything like that, or not really? We're not there yet.
Not there yet. If our monitoring technology that we've been developing, like our drones and our tagging, if that matures a bit more and we can educate the public enough, because remember, it's not an early warning system. We might detect no sharks. Doesn't mean there aren't sharks there, but we don't detect any, and yet there could be a bite there. So we always have to be careful about that. And you're right in that could help people maybe better assess their risks. What we tell people is, look, you should always assume if you're in the water off California, there's a potential of a white shark being near you. Just assume that now.
It's interesting. I have friends that they don't believe that at all. Like I'll say there's definitely great whites in these waters right now. I was at the beach the other day and I said
Mhm.
that and they're like, no way. I'm like, are you kidding? This is like the biggest
Yeah.
population.
Yeah. And chances are they're swimming by people all the time and nobody sees them.
Yeah.
So I always tell people, look, if you spend any amount of time in the ocean, I guarantee a white shark swam right by you and you never saw it. And it didn't bite you. So here you go.
Yeah.
It's a little concerning that people are oblivious to that fact that we're entering their homes and their waters. And, I was actually on Cape Cod last weekend surfing and it's like, I know they're here. I know there's a lot
Yep.
more seals. There are more sharks in the water, but it's a risk that you have to take and understand that you're entering their environment.
Well, and that's another perspective, right? So the perspective is the ocean is our playground. Yes, we do like to recreate in the ocean, but it's also somebody else's home. So the question we should always be asking ourselves are the behaviors, the things that we do in the ocean, are they influencing other animals? And if so, if I were that animal, how would I respond? So I think when people start to think that way, they behave differently, right? It's not so much this is all mine and I can do whatever I want. They would be thinking, well, if somebody came into my house and just plunked themselves down on my couch or went to my fridge, I probably would be upset about that, right?
Yes.
So it's getting people to think along those lines.
Absolutely. And that sort of comes from your own ethos as a person and how you view the environment or how you view yourself in the environment. If you want to be a recreator, or for me, I have a biophiliac ethos
Mhm.
similar to you, I'm sure, where you respect the animals and learn to coexist with them. And it seems that's a more pressing issue in conservation these days. Is how are we going to coexist as we
Mhm.
continue to put pressures on the natural world with the marine life, and in California, the desert even. I'm a desert ecologist, so studying desert tortoise and how our impact is impacting their environment, and mountain lions in the Santa Monicas. Like
Mhm.
there's just so many different things, especially in Southern California. And that's why I think it's so great to have you on the show and really reach our SoCal audience. And I know we are reaching over an hour with our interview, but we just kind of wanted to wrap up with some fun facts and a little bit of a tidbit about, your childhood and how you got to where you were. Are there like any, 5 top fun facts about great whites that you wanted to share with our audience?
Five top. I don't know
Or
about
just a
five.
few?
Um, I would say, I swore I was never going to work on white sharks my entire career.
Ah,
They're
Wow.
overrated. They're prima donnas. And then I saw my first baby and I thought, that is just too cute. They're too cute. They're too cute. They're like tiny miniatures of the adult. They're so cute. And then of course physiologically, they're the Olympians, right? They can, jump higher, swim faster. They're pretty amazing animals when it comes to that. So I'd say those are things that I find very interesting. Um, they're I think we give them more credit than they're due in terms of their foraging capability. Like I think it takes a white shark years to learn how to take down a seal.
Oh, wow.
And
oh,
literally years to learn how to do that because those animals are fast, they're social, they're communicative, they're not an easy target. So I think, initially, and we see this in the juveniles, they're almost goofy. They're like teenagers. They can't seem to be coordinated enough. We see seals chase them and dolphins
Oh,
chase
wow.
them.
My gosh.
So in many ways, they remind me of people.
Well, that's interesting because we have the California sea lion and the harbor seal here in La Jolla, and there's a lot of talk around great whites starting to predate on seals, and there are more seals showing up on La Jolla beaches, and it's quite actually a human wildlife conflict issue that's been a
Mhm.
hot topic lately. I'm sure you're aware of that.
Mhm.
So is it safe to say that these juvenile white sharks here in La Jolla shores that have been seen are not likely to eat these seals or sea lions?
No, no. In fact, those seals and sea lions are probably chasing the sharks.
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and I always have to laugh at that, right? Because people are like, oh, the seals are increasing in number. Remember, as we speak, out on the Channel Islands, there are over 200,000 California sea lions. There are like 12,000 northern elephant seals. There are probably 3 or 4,000 fur seals. If you're an adult white shark and you like to eat seals, why on earth would you waste your time in La Jolla? They can swim 60 miles in a day, no problem. So why bother going to this lonely food cart in the middle of the desert when you can go to Costco and it's only 60 miles away?
Another great analogy. I love it. Yeah, that's hilarious. The Costco reference really gets me. So
Channel Islands are the big box stores for seals. Yes.
that's cool. I didn't know the elephant seals migrated there as well from the Farallon Islands.
Yes. Well,
Okay.
or from the Pacific. So
Okay.
those rookeries range all the way down to Guadalupe.
Oh, cool. Wow. Are there any other little short fun facts that you can think of off the top of your head? I know that bony fish have that swim bladder, but cartilaginous
Mhm.
sharks, they don't have that swim bladder that
No, they
keeps
have
them
a
buoyant, right?
big liver,
Okay.
really big liver full of oil.
Okay.
So
So
it's
what?
good for buoyancy.
Okay, that's what I was going
And
to ask.
then it's also good for energy storage.
Okay. Oh,
So think
cool.
of it like a Tesla battery.
Awesome. So as we kind of move towards the end of the episode, I wanted to ask you what was something about your childhood that influenced what you're doing today?
So I grew up on Martha's Vineyard,
Oh,
where
go
they filmed
figure.
Jaws. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And my
My gosh.
grandfather's a commercial fisherman, and he'd fished there his entire life. My mom's family had been whalers. So I
Cool.
spent a lot of time on the water, fishing, diving, boating. That was pretty much all there was to do. And I loved fishing as a kid. I fished every day if I could. And then one day I think I caught a dogfish. I didn't know what it was. I was a horrible student, horrible. I hated school. And I had to go to the library to figure out what that fish was. And I finally found a book on sharks. And that was it for me. I was like, I had no idea these fish existed. These are the coolest fish ever. So that kind of set me on my track.
That's awesome.
It's funny that you weren't like into school and yet here you are at
I know.
CSU
Trust
Shark
me.
Lab.
I have a lot of teachers from school who are just shaking their heads going, how did that happen?
A great story, though. I mean, it just goes to show that your passion for the ocean and growing up on Martha's Vineyard really influenced like that intersection of passion and science. And now you can use all of that years of experience to help people and sharks.
Well, I think the take-home message and what I tell students is, look, it doesn't matter where you grow up. I mean, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a place like that. I didn't think of it that way when I was growing up, but it doesn't matter where you are. It's the experiences you have. It's the opportunities you get that can change everything. So, for students, especially young students, I'm like, try everything. And then you'll find what sparks you and what gets you excited. So that was the thing, I love doing those things. And I think that's what gave me that opportunity. Even though I was a horrible student, hated that part, I had to accept the fact that I had to do better in school.
Of course. Yeah, I just want to put that on blast as a quote now that your experiences are really what can shape you, and that, if you aren't a straight A student, that doesn't mean you can't do something to make a difference. And that's awesome.
Yeah.
Love that
And
story.
and I have to always set that in some context, because I have to say, and by the way, it can't be what you see on a screen. We're not going to count that as an experience. You've actually to get out and touch it, smell it, feel it, all those things, right? Because otherwise, with this generation, they're like glued to screens, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not an experience. It really isn't. So I think that's what I try to encourage. Go out.
Absolutely.
I think it can spark interest, but yeah, making that effort to go out and be in it, it makes a huge difference and show up, you know. So that's
It's
awesome.
awesome. Yeah. And speaking of quotes, do you have any environmental quotes you wanted to end with and share with our audience?
I guess I wouldn't call it a quote. It's
Sure.
just I think I used to be very worried about the state of the planet, sharks in general, and I think this thing that we're seeing with white sharks has changed my perception of conservation, right? Because I thought it was doomed. It was all doomed. And then I thought, well, if white sharks could come back, what else? So I started, the deeper I dug, the more I realized that we've actually done a lot of good, right? We had some of the most polluted water and air in the US in California in the
That's right.
60s and the 50s. They were the ones that went to Washington and drove the Clean Water and Clean Air Act that is now national. And we have cleaner water and cleaner air now with 8 times more people than we did then. So even though we hear bad news all the time, we have done some pretty impressive things. And the next generation is going to have to keep that going.
Absolutely.
So no matter how depressing it may sound, we need people who are going to, put the gloves on and get to work.
We must have hope for the future.
Yeah, got it.
We must have hope. And I think there's so many success stories that we can reference in our, the North American history of conservation, the California condor being one of them in California. Like, that is my favorite success story, the bald eagle recovering from DDT and the peregrine falcon. If we can put our human resilience and intelligence to the test to have hope and make a difference, then anything is possible.
Yep. Agreed.
Awesome. 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 On the topic of staying hopeful, the Shark Lab needs your help. Unfortunately, the lab has recently lost state funds. This year, they were not considered in the state budget. On average, the lab needs $1 million a year in order to keep their research efforts alive. There is no doubt that the state funding has proven to be valuable, as CSU Shark Lab's research has helped create stronger safety measures for lifeguards and beachgoers to understand shark and stingray behavior while also protecting themselves at the beach. The funding source has been stretched for 6 years, but in just a few months, the advancements the Shark Lab has made could dissolve without the $1 million a year it takes to keep the program going. If Dr. Lowe and his team cannot find private funding or grants to sustain the program, the Shark Lab advancements could come to a halt. That being said, I know it's important that the CSU Shark Lab receive the necessary funding that it needs. What can we do here at Planet People to support your research and students at Cal State Long Beach?
Well, remember our funding was from the state. Write your legislators, tell them the value of the program and what you think it does for the state, what it contributes. We can take donations. If you go to the Shark Lab website, there's a donate button right there. And, basically when you go to the beach, you talk to your lifeguards and you're hanging out there, hopefully you'll see the impact that we've had.
Definitely. And how can our listeners find CSU Shark Lab? You have a website and an Instagram as well, correct?
Yep. So at CSULB Shark Lab, and that's for our Facebook, that's for Instagram, and that's our X account. And then just CSULB Shark Lab, Google that, and automatically our website will pop up.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
And
Coral, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just quickly, you mentioned if you talk with your local lifeguards and seeing the impact, what do you mean by that? Is there signage that you guys have created, and what does that education looked like? I know we're wrapping up. That just sparked another question.
So we provide them with PSAs, we provide them with signage, we have our own comic book series for kids.
Oh,
Cool.
So
wow.
that's on our website, and you can read those for free in English and in Spanish.
nice.
So, there's lots of resources like that, but you don't have to just go to our website. That's why I was saying the lifeguards have that on their websites, on their social media. And in some cases, they're showing up in parking lots, at the beaches, on the back of towers. So those are the things that we've, worked really hard with lifeguards to develop to inform and educate the public.
Yeah, I love that. I love this community-based conservation. We talk a lot about that on this podcast. And the comic book, that is so cool.
Yeah.
We had a guest on a few episodes ago, Amber, and she is always about like creating signage that is simple and easy even for a kid to understand. And I think that that is always going to go farther than something more complicated, and starting that at a young age is so important, and just changing that perception, similar to Jaws, just changing it. And Shark Week does a really good job at that.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to do here as well. So, yeah, that's really great.
Well, thank you so much for your time,
Sure.
Dr. Lowe. I know you're very busy, but we'll do whatever we can to help raise awareness for your team at the Shark Lab, and hopefully get you guys some more fundraising.
Great. That'd be great.
And is there a chance for the state to refund you soon, or is that just
Well,
dependent on the election and all
well,
of that?
it's more dependent on the budget.
Yeah.
So the state budget this year is particularly bad, and
Mm.
probably will be bad next year, but they're expecting that to go up.
Yeah.
So we've been told legislators really like what we do. They get a lot of feedback from their constituents, so it's just a bad budget.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll get back to our state funding because it really benefits the whole state.
Well, especially
Yeah.
with the public safety component, you have so much, your research has so much value beyond just publications and academia, where sometimes those things can be trapped in an echo chamber of scientists and that world of academia. So it's great. I really hope that the state will come back around and give you the fundraising you guys deserve.
Yep, agreed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining the show, Dr. Lowe, and we look
Sure.
forward to getting this interview out to everybody else.
Great. Well, thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Planet People. We are thrilled to have you as part of our community of wildlifers who care about protecting the planet for future generations to enjoy. We hope that by listening to this podcast, you will be inspired to connect with nature and become a steward of the planet by getting involved and taking action with your local community conservation organization. Until next time, stay positive, Planet People. Thank you to my team here at Planet People. This episode was produced by Natalie Jane Sybil, Coral Carson, and Hugh Carr. Edited by Coral Carson. Theme song by Hugh Carr under the artist name Flama. Thank you, team.